The wind carried voices down the mountain pass, mocking and cruel. Building a house in a cave, like savages. That Ezekiel Carter has finally lost his mind, and dragging poor Abigail into his madness. Abigail Carter tightened her grip on her husband's calloused hand as they stood on the frozen cobblestone road, staring up at what would become their home. The December cold of 1,800 bits through her wool shawl, but she refused to shiver. Not now, not when the men from the settlement 2 valleys over were still watching from their horses, waiting to see if the strange couple would turn back. Ezekiel squeezed her hand once their private signal. Trust me, she did. God help her, she did. 3 months earlier, Ezekiel had stood in the doorway of their rented cabin in the Wyoming Territory settlement, his weathered face set with determination. At 32, he'd spent 15 years as a fur trapper and scout, and his body bore the marks of that harsh life, a scarred forearm from a bear encounter near the Green River, a slight limp from a winter fall, hands permanently roughened by rope and leather, and the brutal work of setting steel traps in frozen streams. The land office has nothing left, he'd said quietly, removing his wide-brimmed felt hat. Every decent parcel within 20 miles of the settlement is claimed. What remains is either rocky slope that won't hold a plough, or so far into the wilderness we'd never see another soul. Abigail had looked up from her mending, the afternoon light catching the auburn hair she kept tightly bound beneath her cotton cap. At 26, she'd been married to Ezekiel for 3 years. 3 years of living in borrowed spaces, trading posts, and temporary shelters, while he saved every penny from his trapping runs. She'd kept their accounts in a leather-bound ledger, watching their savings grow with painful slowness. They had $147 saved, enough for a land claim and basic supplies, but not enough for mistakes. "What about the cave?" she'd asked. He'd blinked in surprise. They'd discovered it during a spring hunting trip, an enormous natural cavern in the granite mountainside, its mouth large enough to shelter 3 wagons. The cave ran deep into the mountain, staying dry year-round thanks to an underground stream that flowed out through a crack in the floor before disappearing into the valley below. "People would think us mad," he'd said slowly. "People already think you mad for marrying a Philadelphia merchant's daughter and dragging her to the territories," Abigail had replied, setting down her needle. "What's one more reason?" "The cave faces southeast, you said so yourself. Protected from the northwest winds. There's water, stone for building, timber nearby, and no one else would want it." Ezekiel had pulled out his surveying notes, spreading them on the rough-hewn table. "If we built a cottage just inside the entrance, using the cave as a natural shell." He'd begun sketching, his pencil moving quickly. And so it was decided. The surveyor from the land office, a portly man named Thaddeus Whitmore, had laughed until he wheezed when Ezekiel filed his claim 3 days later. "You want to purchase a cave?" Whitmore had wiped tears from his eyes. "Sir, caves are not habitable dwellings. The Homestead Act of '98 says any citizen can claim 160 acres of surveyed public land by improving it," Ezekiel had interrupted, his voice level. He'd placed a worn copy of the act on the desk. "It doesn't specify the type of dwelling, only that one must be built and inhabited within 6 months." Whitmore had sobered slightly. "You'd build a house. In a cave." "In front of the cave," Ezekiel had corrected, pulling out his sketches. "With the cave as additional shelter and storage. The cottage will face southeast, protected from the worst winds. The cave provides cold storage in summer and insulation in winter. There's water from an underground stream, natural drainage, and a defensible position." Defensible against what? This is 1,800, not the French and Indian War. "Against weather, Mr. Whitmore. against isolation, against the kind of failure that sends half these homesteaders back east within 2 years. Ezekiel had leaned forward. I've seen good men lose everything because they built in the wrong spot. This cave has stood for thousands of years. With proper construction, it'll stand for thousands more. The claim had been filed. Though Whitmore had made certain everyone in the settlement knew about Carter's folly, the filing fee took $8 of their precious savings. The mockery followed them everywhere. At the blacksmith's shop, where Ezekiel ordered custom hinges and iron brackets, the smith made jokes about forging caveman clubs. At the general store, where Abigail purchased winter supplies, 50 pounds of cornmeal, 20 pounds of salt pork, dried beans, coffee, the clerk asked loudly whether cave dwellers used plates or ate from their hands. At the church social in late September, wives whispered behind their hands. She was raised in a proper house, Mrs. Thornton had said, loud enough to be heard, had servants and a feather bed. Now she'll sleep on stone like an animal. Abigail had set down her cider and turned to face the woman. I'll sleep beside my husband in a home we built with our own hands. What stone lies beneath matters less than what love stands above. And as for servants, Mrs. Thornton, I'd rather have the satisfaction of work I've done myself than the false pride of ordering others about. The whispers stopped, at least in her presence. They'd started construction in early September. Ezekiel had learned his techniques from his father, a Pennsylvania carpenter who'd built houses throughout Lancaster County. Now, those half-forgotten skills had to be remembered and applied. The foundation came first, using a 2-man crosscut saw 6 feet long with wooden handles on each end. They'd felled lodgepole pines from the surrounding forest. Ezekiel taught Abigail the rhythm. Push, pull, letting the saw's weight do the work. Her hands blistered within the first week, the skin tearing despite leather gloves. She'd wrapped them in cloth strips, gritted her teeth, and kept working. The blisters became calluses, and her arms grew stronger. They dragged the logs to the cave, using Ezekiel's 2 mules, Steadfast and Constance. The animals were hardy Missouri mules, bred for mountain work. They cost $26, nearly a sixth of the couple's savings, but proved their worth hauling timber up the winding cobblestone road. The logs were hewn square using a broadaxe, a tool that required both strength and precision. Ezekiel would snap a chalk line down each log's length, marking the cutting line with powdered charcoal. Then, standing atop the log, with legs spread for balance, he'd work his way down it, swinging the broadaxe in controlled arcs that sent chips flying with each strike. The blade had to bite just deep enough, too shallow, and progress would be painfully slow. Too deep, and he'd risk cutting into the log's core. Each log took hours of steady work, and by day's end his shoulders burned with exhaustion. Abigail learned to use the draw knife, a 2-handled blade that required different muscles and a different rhythm. She'd sit astride the logs, bracing her feet, and pull the curved blade toward her body, shaving away ribbons of wood to create smooth surfaces. Her back would ache from the awkward position, but the satisfaction of seeing rough logs transformed into clean, square timbers kept her going. Once squared, the logs were notched at the corners using the half-dovetail method. This technique created a wedge-shaped notch that locked the logs together as the building settled. Each notch had to be cut with axe and chisel, then tested repeatedly. Too loose and wind would whistle through. Too tight and the wood might split when it swelled with moisture. Why not just live in the cave itself? Abigail had asked one evening in early October. Stone sweats, Ezekiel had explained, running his hand along the granite cave wall. In winter, when warm air from a fire meets cold stone, moisture condenses and runs down. We'd be sleeping in dampness, and dampness brings sickness. but a wooden cottage built just inside the cave mouth, with proper ventilation and a stone foundation that stays dry. The cave becomes a shell around our home, breaking wind, holding heat. For the roof, they'd used split cedar shakes, each one hand-rived from log sections using a froe, an L-shaped blade with a wooden handle. Abigail learned to place the froe's edge along the wood grain and strike the blades back with a wooden mallet, feeling for the grain, letting the wood split naturally. Each shake needed to be about a 1/4 inch thick. They'd need over 2,000 shakes for adequate roof overlap, and every one had to be made by hand. Abigail's shoulders ached from the repetitive motion, but she worked steadily, building up a stockpile. The chimney proved the greatest challenge. They'd spent 2 full weeks gathering river stones from the valley below, selecting flat granite and limestone pieces that could stack securely. The stones had to be carried up the mountain path in canvas bags loaded onto the mules. Ezekiel mixed mortar from lime, sand, and water. Lime purchased at considerable expense. Sand collected from a river deposit and carefully sifted. He taught Abigail to test consistency by scooping some onto a trowel and turning it upside down. Too wet and it would drip immediately. Too dry and it would crumble. "My father built his mortar with river clay and horsehair," she'd said. "Your father lived in Pennsylvania, where winters are mild," Ezekiel had replied, working mortar between stones with careful precision. "This mortar needs to withstand 40 below zero. Lime mortar, when properly mixed and cured, becomes nearly as hard as stone itself." The chimney rose slowly, stone by stone. It had to be perfectly vertical, Ezekiel checked constantly with a plumb line. Any lean could cause structural failure or poor draft. The interior flue had to maintain consistent dimensions, smooth and free of protrusions that might catch creosote and cause chimney fires. At night, by candlelight tallow candles they'd made by dipping cotton wicks into rendered animal fat, Ezekiel would sketch the next day's work in his father's leather-bound journal. Abigail would sew, making curtains from traded cotton cloth, stitching quilts from scraps, preparing small comforts. She made pillows stuffed with dried grass and deer hair. She hemmed dish towels from old flour sacks. By late November, with first snows threatening, the cottage was complete. 16 by 20 feet, with a sleeping loft reached by a ladder made from peeled pine poles. The main floor held a stone hearth, sharing a wall with the cave for additional insulation. A work table Ezekiel had built from hewn planks. A smaller eating table, 2 chairs, and wall hooks for clothes and equipment. Windows were covered with scraped sheep's bladder stretched across wooden frames, expensive glass being beyond their means and likely to break during transport up the rough mountain path. The bladder, obtained from the settlement's butcher in trade for 3 rabbit pelts, had been carefully cleaned by soaking it in cold water for days, scraping away all tissue and fat with the edge of a spoon, then stretching it tight across frames Ezekiel had carved from ash wood. As it dried in the sun over several days, it became translucent, allowing soft light to filter through while keeping out the bitter wind. It wasn't transparent enough to see through. Clearly shapes and movement were visible, but details were blurred, but it served its purpose well. In spring, Abigail planned to replace one window with oiled paper, which would provide a slightly clearer view of the valley below and the mountains beyond. The door was a masterpiece of frontier craftsmanship. Thick pine planks, each one carefully selected for straight grain and lack of knots that might weaken the structure, held together by 3 horizontal battens and diagonal bracing. All pieces were joined with hand-forged iron straps that Ezekiel had hammered out himself at the blacksmith's forge, spending 2 full days heating, shaping, and punching holes for the nails. The door hung on massive strap hinges, also forged by Ezekiel, that could support the weight without sagging. The door fitted so snugly in its frame that Ezekiel had to plane the edges 3 times before achieving the perfect balance between tight fit and easy operation. Wool felt, purchased at considerable expense and carefully hoarded, was tacked around all 4 edges to block drafts that might otherwise steal precious heat. Inside the cave, behind the cottage, they'd built storage shelves from split logs, creating organized spaces. They dug a cold box into the cave floor, near where the underground stream ran, a stone-lined pit where temperatures stayed just above freezing. This would keep meat fresh, butter from melting, milk from souring. Near the cave entrance beyond the cottage, Ezekiel had built a workshop area with a split log workbench, storage for trapping equipment, steel traps of various sizes, chain, rope, skinning knives, stretching boards for pelts. When finished in late November, Ezekiel had carved above the door, "Carter 1800 by our hands." The day they'd moved in had been bitterly cold, temperatures already well below freezing despite being only early December. Abigail had dressed in her Sunday clothes, a simple woolen dress, the colour of deep pine, her warmest shawl, and the bonnet her mother had sent from Philadelphia. Everything they owned fit into 2 canvas bags, a small trunk that had been her grandmother's, and a wooden crate, clothes, tools, her father's Bible, Ezekiel's trapping equipment, and the few luxuries she'd insisted upon: a silver hand mirror, a book of poems by William Cowper, and a china teacup painted with roses. The settlement men had followed them up the mountain path that day, not to help, but to witness what they assumed would be a failure. They'd sat on their horses at a distance, watching as Ezekiel and Abigail walked hand in hand up that final slope. "Last chance to turn back, Carter," someone had shouted. "Winter's coming hard. You'll freeze in that stone hole." Ezekiel had stopped, turned, and called back. "Come spring, when your roofs are leaking and your walls rotting from trapped moisture, remember that stone doesn't leak and mountains don't rot. Good day, gentlemen." They'd crossed the threshold together, Abigail's small bag in one hand, Ezekiel's rough palm in the other. The mockers had been right about the cold. December brought snow measured in feet rather than inches. The wind howled through the mountain pass with a sound like tortured voices. Temperatures plunged so low that water in their drinking bucket froze solid overnight despite being near the hearth. But the cave dwelling held. The massive stone cavern behind their cottage acted like a giant thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly through the night. The cave's depth meant rear chambers stayed at a constant 45 degrees cold, but far above the 0 or below temperatures outside. That slightly warmer air circulated forward, creating a buffer zone around their cottage. Ezekiel had designed ventilation carefully. Small gaps at the top of cottage walls allowed moisture to escape while the cave's natural draft pulled fresh air through. They never experienced the suffocating dampness that plagued poorly built log cabins. The underground stream, running beneath their feet through a crack in the cave floor, never froze. They could always access water without venturing into blizzards outside a luxury other settlers lacked. Their days fell into rhythm. Ezekiel would wake before dawn, rebuild the fire from banked coals he'd learned to cover coals with ash each night, keeping them alive with minimal fuel. Using char cloth kept in a sealed tin, he could have flames going within minutes. He'd prepare simple breakfast, cornmeal mush with salt pork. After morning prayers from the worn Bible, he'd check trap lines when weather permitted, bringing home rabbits, beaver, occasionally a deer. Abigail managed the household with precise efficiency. She'd organized supplies by season and need, winter stores in the coldest cave part, daily staples near the cottage entrance, tools in the workshop area. She'd learned to cook over an open hearth, to spin wool using a drop spindle, to make soap from wood ash and rendered fat. In evenings, by candlelight or hearth fire, Ezekiel would work leather mending harnesses, crafting pouches, waterproofing boots with bear grease. Abigail would sew or read aloud from her poetry book, or teach Ezekiel to read better till he'd learned basic letters as a boy, but never mastered it fully. They were not merely surviving, they were building a life. The blizzard came in late January. Ezekiel had sensed it, coming days in advance, a pressure in the air that made his old injuries ache, a strange yellow cast to the clouds, the way animals had gone silent. Even the mules had been restless. He'd spent 2 full days preparing, doubling the wood supply stacked against the cottage wall, bringing the mules into the cave's rear chamber, where they'd built a stable area, filling every container with water from the stream, checking food supplies. How long? Abigail had asked. 3 days, maybe 4. He'd tested door hinges, checked the chimney for blockages, secured shutters. We'll be fine. The cave has weathered 10,000 such storms. But he hadn't anticipated the wind. It began at sunset on January 23rd, a low moan that built to a shriek within the hour. Snow didn't fall so much as fly horizontally, driven by winds exceeding 60 miles per hour. The temperature plummeted to 20 below zero, then 30 below, then kept dropping. Inside their cottage, with the door barred and shutters secured, they were safe, but not comfortable. The wind found every tiny gap in their construction, creating eerie whistles and moans. Snow forced through cracks around the door, forming small drifts that had to be swept out regularly. The chimney presented the greatest danger. The wind created backdrafts that pushed smoke into the room, forcing them to carefully tend the fire, keeping it hot enough for warmth, but not so large that smoke became unbearable. Ezekiel hung a dampened cloth across the hearth opening, creating a baffle that helped control draft. On the second day, January 24th, they heard a sound like thunder at midday, deep, rolling, vibrating through the stone beneath their feet. The entire mountain seemed to shake. Avalanche, Ezekiel said grimly. Somewhere on the eastern slope, massive from the sound. Could it reach us? Her voice was steady, despite her fear. He pulled her close. The cave angle's wrong for slide paths. We're safe. But his jaw was tight with worry. The third day, January 25th, brought the real crisis. Abigail had been checking food stores in the cave's cold storage area when she heard Ezekiel shout. She'd rushed back to find him staring at the cottage's rear wall, the one abutting the cave face. A crack had appeared in the stone, a dark line running from floor to ceiling, perhaps an inch wide at its widest point. The frost, he said, running his hand along the fissure. It's gotten into the mountain stone. Water seeps into tiny cracks, freezes, expands with tremendous force. If enough water freezes, even as he spoke, they heard a grinding sound. The crack widened visibly, opening another 1/4 inch. If that wall collapses, Abigail didn't finish the thought. They both knew their cottage would be crushed. They would lose everything. Ezekiel moved with decisive speed. We need to shore it up, now, before it gets worse. They worked through the day and into the night, driven by desperation. Using logs they'd kept for repairs, Ezekiel built a framework of supports against the threatened wall, creating a structure that would distribute weight and pressure across multiple points. They drove wedges between the supports and the wall, checking constantly for further movement. They wedged stones into gaps, packed cracks with moss and clay. Abigail's hands bled from handling frozen wood. Ezekiel's fingers went numb repeatedly, then began to blacken with frostbite at the tips. But they didn't stop. Why? Abigail asked at one point, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. It was past midnight, the storm still raging. Why did we do this? Why not just take a normal homestead? Ezekiel paused in his work, looking at her across the lamplight. His face was drawn with exhaustion. Because normal homesteads fail, Abigail. Half the claims in this territory are abandoned within 2 years. The land is too hard, the weather too harsh. But this, he gestured at the cave around them, this has stood for ages. With human cleverness added, it could stand for ages more. We're not just building a house. We're building something that will outlast us. If we survive to morning, she said, but she was smiling through her tears. When we survive to morning, he corrected, they did survive. The wall held, reinforced by their desperate engineering. The storm finally broke on the 4th day, revealing a world transformed by snow. Drifts stood 8 feet high against the cave entrance. The settlement men came up the mountain path 6 days after the storm ended. The pass had been completely blocked by drifts 12 feet deep in places, requiring dozens of men working in shifts to dig through. They'd come expecting to find bodies, or at best, 2 half-frozen fools ready to admit defeat. Several men had brought extra blankets and food for an evacuation. Instead, they found Ezekiel splitting firewood outside the cave entrance, his breath steaming in the morning air. Smoke rose from their chimney in a straight, healthy column. The mules could be heard braying from inside the cave, loud and healthy, and Abigail emerged from the cottage door with a bucket of water freshly drawn from the underground stream. Thaddeus Whitmore, the surveyor, dismounted slowly. He stared at the scene, the intact cottage, the smoking chimney, the well-fed animals, the couple who looked tired but undeniably alive and healthy. You survived, he said. We did more than survive, Ezekiel replied, setting down his axe. Come, I'll show you. He led them into the cave, past the cottage with its warm interior, past the stable area where Steadfast and Constance stood in clean straw. He showed them the cold storage area, where smoked meat and root vegetables were perfectly preserved, the workshop with its neat tool rows, the emergency supplies organized in wooden crates. Everything was labeled and stored with precision. Do you know what happened to the Johnson place? One settlement man said quietly. Their roof collapsed under snow weight. They lost half their supplies, nearly froze. The Hendersons' chimney fire, added another, burned their cabin to the ground. They barely escaped with their lives, lost everything. They're living with neighbours now. 6 families abandoned their claims, Whitmore said heavily. 6 out of 23 in the valley settlements. The storm was too much. But you. He looked around the cave with something like awe. You thought of everything. Not everything, Ezekiel admitted. We nearly lost the rear wall to frost heaving. Had to shore it up during the storm. But we adapted. That's what this place allows. Adaptation, without abandoning everything. Whitmore ran his hand along the cave wall. I owe you an apology, Carter, both of you. You weren't mad. You were practical. More practical than the rest of us. Will the land office honour the claim? Abigail asked. Honoured? Whitmore laughed. Mrs. Carter, I'm going to recommend your property as a model of innovative homesteading. You've improved the land, built a permanent dwelling, and demonstrated year-round habitability under extreme conditions. The claim is solid. As the men prepared to leave, young Thomas Fletcher, who'd been among the loudest mockers, approached Ezekiel. He looked embarrassed, his hat held in his hands. Mr. Carter, I filed a claim on the North Ridge. But after this winter, after seeing what happened, there's a cave on my property, smaller than yours, but deep and dry. Would you help me? Ezekiel glanced at Abigail, who nodded. Come back when the pass clears fully in spring. Ezekiel said. Bring good tools and willingness to learn. We'll help you build it right. March brought the thaw, and with it, visitors who came steadily up the mountain path. The Carters' cave dwelling became something of a curiosity, but no longer a mockery. Families came to see how it was done, to learn from Ezekiel's designs, to understand the principles that made it work. Abigail taught the women about cave storage, about managing moisture, about the unexpected advantages of living partially underground, the temperature stability, the protection from wind, the natural cold storage. Some were skeptical, but others saw the potential. By April, 2 more families had begun building cave-front dwellings of their own. By June, there were 5. The settlement changed its view slowly, but it changed. The Carters were no longer the strange couple who'd made a foolish choice. They were pioneers of a different sort, innovators, who'd looked at the harsh land and found a way to work with it rather than against it. On their first anniversary of moving in, December 1801, Ezekiel and Abigail stood on that same cobblestone road where they'd first walked hand in hand toward their new home. Behind them, the cave dwelling stood solid and warm, smoke rising from its chimney into the clear winter sky. "Do you regret it?" Ezekiel asked quietly. "The life you left in Philadelphia?" Abigail thought of her father's house, the servants, the featherbed, the easy comfort. Then she thought of what she'd gained, the strength in her hands, the knowledge in her mind, the partnership with her husband that went beyond simple marriage bonds. They'd built something together, with their own hands and wits. "Not for a moment," she said firmly. They'd proven something important, that survival in the wild territories wasn't just about strength or stubbornness. It was about observation, adaptation, innovation, and the courage to do what seemed impossible. The mountain still loomed above them, vast and ancient. But it no longer felt threatening. It felt like shelter, like home, like the foundation upon which they were building a future. And in the years that followed, as more families learned from the Carters' example, as the settlement grew and changed, as the harsh Wyoming territory slowly became something resembling civilization, people would remember the couple who'd had the audacity to build their home in a cave. They'd remember and they'd tell the story to their children, the story of Ezekiel and Abigail Carter, who'd stood hand in hand on a frozen road in December of 1800, looking up at an impossible dream and had made it real through nothing more than skill, determination, and love. The cave dwelling stood for 73 years, outlasting its builders and sheltering 3 generations of Carters before finally being abandoned when the railroad came through in 1873. Even then, the structure remained sound, the logs barely rotted, the stone foundations solid as the day it was laid. They'd built something that would last, and that, in the end, was all they'd ever wanted.